Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about. It's an experience which you don't often tell, because, well, to put it plainly, because you don't care about being called a liar. You're a strong and large man, not easily scared, only, you found out what fear was. What it was like to be so terrified, you froze. So you have made a friend since that experience, and he has talked you into telling him your story. Maybe it's for the best, but will he believe you about the terror of the bond? The terror of the bond. See those hills over there? Said the doctor, with a jerk of his head. Strike you as looking at all eerie? Yes, a bit ghostly, perhaps, in this light, I admitted. Sintra, isn't it? The doctor nodded, and puffed meditatively at his pipe for a minute without speaking. A mood of quiet seemed to be upon him, and I, having known him intimately for rather more than 3 weeks, marveled at the phenomenon. The hills we were speaking about stood out as black jags against the north, and as the doctor kept his gaze fixed on them, I distinctly saw him shiver. It was early September, and we had just finished dinner. He could not possibly be cold. We were on the promenade deck of the RMS Orinoco, watching the pilot work her out of the Togas, homeward bound. Behind us was the bright cake city of Lisbon, whose windows the evening sun had half an hour ago turned into flashing mirrors of glory. But the gloaming falls quickly in Portugal, and already the street lamps were picking the city out into a bewildering pattern of crisscross, while right over our stern a few stars had risen above the mists of the upriver marshes. Ahead of us, beyond the winking red and white eye of the Baguio lighthouse, the horizon of sea and sky was still blurred by the purple of the dying sunset, and straight over the starboard deck rail, against which the doctor and I were leaning, were the hills of Sintra, looking like ragged notches of black velvet against the blue metal sheen of the north. It was all very much like a brightly colored oleograph, but it was pretty, and, yes, perhaps, just a little bit unreal. You think it's the light that makes the hills look eerie? Said the doctor presently. Dare say you're right. To me, though, they'd be ghostly in bright sunlight. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But it's the truth. I held my peace, for I am a journalist, and I scented a story. I waited for him to go on unprompted. Should you say I was a chap who would be easily scared? He asked after a pause of a minute blue funk, you know, and that sort of thing. For answer I quizzed him up and down. He stood over 6 feet, and I knew he had been a rugby forward blue at Cambridge. Moreover, I'd myself seen him tackle 3 drunken coal trimmers at once, in the harbour at Pernambuco. And the coal trimmers had had the worst of it. I'd trust you to hold your end up in a pother, said I judicially. You wouldn't call me a nervous man, either, he went on. I had watched him playing poker in the smoking room, when the luck was going queerly. I wouldn't call you a nervous man, either, I answered with conviction. The doctor laughed. Well, said he, all the same, I got a scare among those hills there which put me off my corn for a week, and I can't tell you now what it was that frightened me. Try, I murmured, and dropped my gaze with elaborate carelessness upon the swishing water below us. The doctor shook his head and laughed again, a curious little laugh that had no suggestion of mirth in it. I can't tell you, he replied presently, simply because I don't know. I haven't even a theory about it that you wouldn't pity me for. But I see what you mean. Of course, you want the yarn. He looked at me sideways, out of the corner of his eyes, and I thought that he was doubtful about trusting me. All right, he said after a minute. I'll tell you. Come down to my cabin. Somebody is sure to interrupt us if we stay up here. I don't ask you to believe the yarn, mind, unless you like, but I do stipulate that you shall believe that I believe it. It's an experience which I don't often tell, because, well, to put it plainly, because I don't care about being called a liar. He spoke quickly, and finished with another laugh, but I saw that he was nervous. I gave the required promise readily enough, for, in addition to the fact that, I admit it shamelessly, I wanted copy, I have lived in this world long enough to have learned the lesson that there is sometimes wisdom in believing in the things which men call impossible. I have mentioned Jack Merrick's name to you, I think, began the doctor when our pipes and glasses were charged. I was staying with him at his quinta in the Sintra Hills. When? Hold on. I interrupted. We'd better start fair, I think. You have not mentioned Jack Merrick's name to me. You have spoken of a Miss Merrick to me, and confided to me, more than once, that you're going to be married after 2 more trips in the Orinoco. But I never heard of Jack. He's Nora's brother. Thought I told you, explained the doctor innocently. It was just after Nora and I became engaged, about 2 years, that is, before I signed on as Doctor of the Orinoco. Jack was something unromantic in the Lisbon trade, cork and sardines, I think, but I'm not sure, and Nora was keeping house for him. He'd bought a quinta at Sintra, with a very fair house on it, which had been untenanted for half a dozen years. It had the reputation of being haunted, and the 2 previous owners had both come to their death there. Nobody quite knew how, so Jack got the property cheap. Now, of course, as soon as I heard this, I was as keen as mustard on having a see at the ghost, and I got my first surprise when I found that Jack objected strongly to my doing anything of the sort. I thought at first he was joking, and he had to lose his temper before I would believe he was in earnest. Didn't think you were superstitious, Jack, I grumbled, with some chagrin. I'm not, he retorted hotly. There's no more of that sort of foolishness in me than there is in you, that I'm aware of. Then he hesitated. Then he went on in a musing sort of way, like a man speaking to himself. But I haven't yet found out what killed my 2 predecessors in this property, he said. Well, of course, I didn't understand him, and I told him so, but he showed me plainly, and with some little temper, that he didn't mean to explain. So we fell to discussing the weather, which, so far as I remember, was in no way worthy of discussion just then. Next morning, the first strange thing happened. You've never been in Sintra? Then you may not know that the lemon groves there are mostly worked by irrigation, and nearly every little quinta has its own water tank somewhere about it, cement-lined ponds mostly, 15 or 20 feet deep and anything from 10 to 30 or 40 yards long. Grand places they are for a morning swim, too clear and deep, and not too warm to be pleasant. The one in Merrick's quinta was a bit different from the general run of them. It was bigger, and there was no cement about it. The sides of it were built up of big stones, more or less squared, and laid in courses one above the other, not unlike an old-fashioned quayside in very bad repair. It was supposed to be the oldest tank in the district, and lady antiquaries, who came down for the Sintra season, amused themselves by making shots at its history, and gave themselves the most delicious thrills by half-believing the mysteries which they invented about it. It was really an eerie spot, you know, black, gloomy-looking water, with an old-world suggestion of the moated Grange about it, and, unlike every other tank in Sintra, its waters were never brightened by the red flash of a turning goldfish. But, though there were no goldfish, there were water snakes, and, if local belief went for anything, enough of them to throw the surface into ripples, when they all started frolicking at once. However, every Sintra pond has some of these green and white chaps, and they aren't poisonous, so people who are not nervous don't let them interfere with the morning dip. I had put on a dressing gown over my bathing suit and come downstairs, feeling, I remember, particularly cheerful that morning, for, among other things, it was going to be a lovely day. As soon as I got outside the door I was nearly bowled over by a small boy who cannoned into me with a plump. He was a youth whom I'd noticed about the house, cleaning knives and bicycles and that sort of thing. He took me fairly in the middle, head down, and before I'd recovered my wind enough to cuff him, he took my breath away in another sense, by starting off into a regular gale of chatter and gesticulation. It was extraordinary, a sort of paroxysm of talking, it seemed to me, and I began to wonder if it had that something unusual was up, so I shouted for Jack to come and see what the bother was. The kid, however, was acute enough to see that I didn't understand, and, apparently, he thought there wasn't time to wait for an interpreter. Anyway, he stopped the speed record business, and said distinctly enough, 3 or 4 times, "Menina Nora," and pointed vigorously in the direction of the pond. "What do you want with Menina Nora?" I demanded. "Menina Nora," he repeated impatiently, running a few steps up the path to the pond and then stopping to wait for me. "Menina Nora. Vamos, senor." I knew enough to understand what that meant. "All right, young shaver," said I, "I'll come." And I shouted to Jack that I was going up to the tank. "Anything wrong?" asked Jack, putting his head out of the window. "I'm just finishing dressing." "Don't know," I shouted back. "Better follow me as soon as you can." I was halfway to the tank by this time, and another 20 yards brought me within view of it. What I saw then made me do the last bit at a sprint. And when I stopped, my heart was thumping harder than the mere physical exercise warranted. Nora was lying on the ground, near one corner of the tank, where a flight of stone steps led down into the water. She seemed to have fainted. I gave a yell for Jack, and bent down anxiously to try her pulse. I felt it flicker, and at the same time she moved slightly. I wasn't a fully qualified medico at that time, you know, but I knew enough to recognize thankfully that it was only a faint, after all. Then I began to speculate. She had been in the water I saw, for the bathing suit which she was wearing was wet. I noticed, too, that the edge of the tank was pretty well splashed, and I took that to mean that she had been amusing herself by diving. All this I saw at the first glance, and at the second I saw something else, which, however, was not so easy to read. A grey fur cloak, which I knew Nora used for running out from the house to the tank and back again, had been drawn over her as she lay on the ground. And here was the thing which I could in no ways understand, though everything else about her was wet, sopping wet in fact, this cloak was perfectly dry. I ran my hand along its edge. There were not even any traces of where her wet hands must have touched it in drawing it up. By the time I'd made quite sure of this, Jack was beside me. He lifted Nora up in his arms like a child of 10, and carried her into the house, and I followed at his heels. Now, of course, Nora's faint had given me a bit of a scare, for I knew well enough that she was not the sort of girl who would go off if a mouse squeaked, but when I caught sight of the look on Jack's face, and saw his staring eyes, and the great horror which was drawing the muscles of his face and twitching in spasms round his mouth, something impelled me to keep quiet about my own misgivings. Terror is infectious, they say. Be that as it may, I tell you the simple truth when I say that at that moment I dared not ask him what it was that he feared. He carried Nora to her room, shouting on the way for some of the Portuguese maids to come and put her to bed. Then he got his bicycle, and waited at the front door with me. We neither of us said a word until the message was brought to us that Menina Nora had come to herself again, but there was no need for the Signories to be alarmed. She was just a little bit hysterical. Jack received this news with a nod, and put his foot on the step of his bicycle. "I'll fetch the doctor," he said to me. "I don't suppose it's necessary, really, but you'd better," I agreed. "One never knows, and it's safer, anyway. Meanwhile, I'll go and have a look round that tank." Jack was on his machine by this time, but almost before I got the words out, he had dismounted again. "Don't do anything of the sort," he commanded. I saw his knuckles whiten as he clutched his handlebars. I positively gaped at him in amazement. "Why on earth not?" I asked. "Nonsense, Jack. Of course I will. Can't you see, man? I want to find out who threw that cloak over Nora after she fainted. Some low blackguard must have frightened her, of course, and he may have left tracks behind him." "I tell you I won't allow it," persisted Jack stubbornly, and then I noted with astonishment the shiver which ran across his shoulders and cut his next words short. It struck me that the movement was like that of a man who shrinks from the touch of something foul, and, seeing it, I wondered uncomprehendingly. "Oh, all right," he said wearily, "do as you like. But for God's sake be careful." And before one could ask him what he meant, he jumped onto his machine and was off down the road to the village. Now this behavior of Jack's piqued me, scared me a little, but more than anything, made me curious. I didn't understand it, you see, and if it had been anybody but Lack, I think I should have been just a little bit suspicious. Why should he want me to keep away from the pond? I thought for a bit, and I couldn't see any reason, so, like a conceited idiot, I decided that there was no reason, and that a bee had somehow made its way into my friend Jack's bonnet. I was a cocksure young fool in those days, you'll observe. When I got back to the tank again, I set about a brisk hunt for traces of the man who had drawn the cloak over Nora. It occurred to me once that it might have been the boy, but that was too simple an explanation for me to accept in my present frame of mind. Besides, it wasn't the sort of thing that a boy would be likely to do in any case, and this kid obviously had been thoroughly frightened, and had run helter-skelter for assistance. No, there had been someone else on the spot when Nora fainted, I was sure. A ripple on the pond caught my eye. The dead surface was momentarily ruffled, as though a light cat's paw of air had touched it. But as I looked, it struck me that this was not quite like a wind ripple either, for it traveled slowly across one corner of the tank, and then returned steadily over its own path without any diminution of volume. Besides, it had not, so far as I could judge, reached to within 2 feet of the wall of the tank before turning back on itself in this curious way. It was just as though some great submerged hand had waved a branch once back and forth, near the surface but without breaking it. I remembered the pond's reputation. A water snake on the prowl, I decided, and turned to continue my search. Now I don't know what I expected to find. In fact, I don't know that I really expected to find anything, but, all the same, I did pick up what I thought was a trail. You know what grass looks like in the cobweb season, before the sun has been up long enough to evaporate the dew which makes the delicate gossamers visible. And you know that if a man walked through a patch of such grass, his path would be marked by the destruction of myriads of these little dew gems. Well, that's exactly what I saw, and I followed up the track for over 100 yards without a check. Then I came to an ox cart road. I stopped and debated about going further. I didn't like throwing up a hot scent like this, but then I didn't know where the ox road led to. Quite conceivably it might lead to civilization, and I wasn't in civilized attire. I decided, therefore, to go and dress, and then to bring Jack and show him what I had found. I really began to like my theory that Sonic Scoundrel had frightened Nora while she was bathing. When I came to the pond again, the shadows were lying on it motionless once more. The water snake, or whatever it was that had caused the ripples, had gone home. Now you know the temptation of a quiet, deep pool, and besides, I was in my bathing suit, and Jack couldn't possibly have returned yet. I would have just one plunge. I threw off my dressing gown and dived. I rose to the surface shaking the hair out of my eyes, and laughing aloud in pure joy of the cold water. I swam once round the tank, and then threw myself onto my back for a moment, and kicked wantonly like a babe. I tell you this because I wish to emphasize the fact that I was in perfect bodily health and spirits, and therefore, one would think, not in the least likely to be affected by morbid fancies. But as I lay there and splashed, a sudden feeling of vague, indefinable discomfort took hold of me. I had a sense of danger near at hand, but I did not know in what direction to look for it. If you've never experienced that feeling, pray that you never may. As a child I never knew myself what it was to have nerves, so I can't speak from experience, but I should imagine that what I felt then was very like the physical shrinking which a nervous child feels in the presence of the big unknown dark. I tell you it was horrible. Next I became conscious of a faint, disagreeable smell. It was a smell which somehow it seemed to me that I knew, but at the moment I could not put a name to it. It grew stronger, and filled my nostrils, and a rush of nausea came over me. I shivered heavily, and began to cough and spit, as though I had swallowed something vile. Then came the terror suddenly, uncontrollably, and with a jerk I threw myself over onto my side, and swam for the landing steps, yelling with the full power of my lungs. Just as I reached the edge I felt something touch me on the arm, and I struggled up the steps and fell in a heap upon my dressing gown, where I lay, sobbing hysterically, and shuddering in the warm sunshine like a man in an ague. It was a good 5 minutes before I recovered enough strength of mind to be ashamed of myself. I was shivering till my teeth rattled, and that, too, on a July morning in Portugal. And yet I was not cold. I was warmer than I am now in this stuffy cabin, and I could feel the perspiration starting hot all over me, but still I shivered. I was scared as a child is in a dark wood when a rabbit stamps in the silence. It was cowardly, it was unreasonable. I told myself angrily that it was positively disgraceful. For I had seen nothing, I had heard nothing, and it was broad, staring daylight. I had not even the child's excuse of the big dark. And yet I went on shivering. But that thing that had touched me, that sickly and yet familiar smell, which I could not name, that terror of death, and worse than death, what were they? I swore at myself for a fool, and rose unsteadily to my feet, and put on my dressing gown. I started to walk back to the house, and my feet planted themselves with a jerky uncertainty as I walked, for I was shivering heavily still. I gave a glance back at the water. The commotion of my frenzied swim was dying away in long, glistening undulations, but the surface was oily and dead. I looked for the ripple in the Kummer. It was not there. I thought I had regained control over myself by the time I reached the house, but my appearance must have told something of the horror which I had gone through. Jack was standing at the door. He gave one look at my face, and then his eyebrows went up, and he cried in a low, rapid voice. "You've felt it too? My God! My God!" "I've felt it too," I answered wearily. "But what have I felt, Jack? What's the awful thing in the water up there?" "The terror of the pond," he answered, and repeated 3 or 4 times in a strange, frightened whisper, "The terror of the pond." I shot a quick look at him, and I didn't like what I saw. His fingers were clasping and unclasping themselves nervously, and his mouth had begun to mumble. "How's Nora?" I asked sharply. He gave his shoulders a shake, and seemed to pull himself together with a jerk. "Better," he answered. "Oh yes, she's better. She's asleep. The doctor says she'll be all right when she wakes. She's only had a fright, you know." Then he turned to me with a queer smile. "You know what that means? You've had a fright yourself, haven't you?" "Yes," I said with a shudder, "I have. Look here, Jack, I've something to tell you. But I'll go and dress first." "Where shall I find you?" "In the library. I've something to tell you too." "I'll be ready in 10 minutes, I promised." "All right," said Jack. "Don't make a noise upstairs. Let Nora have her sleep out." "Of course," I answered somewhat indignantly, but I was pleased that he had thought of it. When I came downstairs I found Jack sitting at his library table, examining an old parchment which he had in his hand. The uncomfortable helplessness of his manner of 10 minutes ago had left him, and instead he was alert, wide awake, and businesslike. I was glad to see the change, and, judging by my own past sensations, I appreciated the effort of will which had brought it about. "You're feeling all right now, Jack?" I said cheerily. "Yes," he answered, "I'm all right. And you? Are you all right? Are you game for a fight? A stiff fight, you know, with, maybe, an awful danger in it? This thing has got to come to an end." I nodded. "Good," said he, "then we'll see it through together." "I'd like to know what I'm fighting, though," I explained. "You can't," said Jack shortly. "At least, I can't tell you. If a name will satisfy you, I can give you that. It's the terror of the pond, but what the thing is which causes that terror, well, that's what we've got to find out." "The terror of the pond," I repeated. "You've used those words before. Why do you call it that?" He pointed to the yellow parchment in front of him. "That's what it's called in this," he said, "and I fancy the writer of it knew. It's Old Portuguese, I'll translate." "Wait a minute," I interrupted. "I'll tell you my part first. Where does the Ox Road on the north of the pond lead to?" "To Collares, eventually." "That's the wine place, isn't it?" I asked. "Yes. Why?" "It's 4 miles off," I said. "Are there any houses on the way?" "Only one, and that a mere hovel. An old woman lives in it who makes a living by selling roast chestnuts. But what's your idea?" I told him about the cloak which had been drawn by dry hands over Nora as she lay on the ground, and about the path which I had tracked through the grass by the destruction of the dewdrops. The old chestnut roaster did not seem to fit in very well with my theory that Nora had been frightened by some prowling blackguard, but, in spite of that, I clung obstinately to the theory. For the truth was that I shrank with a heavy loathing from believing that Nora had experienced that same awful terror of the water which had set me howling like a hysterical child. Jack saw what I meant, but he shook his head. "It was the old chestnut woman," he said. "She came and told me about it while you were upstairs. She was passing along the Ox Road, it seems, and heard a cry from the pond. She hurried up to the place, and was just in time to see Nora fall. The boy who met you at the door had heard the cry too, and came running up to see what was the matter. The chestnut woman sent him for assistance, and then threw the cloak over Nora. After that, well, she admits that she went off at once as fast as her tottering old legs would carry her." "Why on earth didn't she wait till some of us came?" I asked indignantly. Jack gave me a quick look. "I don't know," said he quietly. "She doesn't seem to know either. She says she was afraid. Perhaps you and I can understand that." I shuddered. I could not help it. "Fire ahead with your manuscript," I said. "Now, I'm not going to bore you by repeating that old document to you by heart. I could do it, because afterwards I got Jack to write out an English translation of it for me, and I've pored over that so long and so often that I believe I know the exact place on the pages where every sentence begins." It was the diary of one Antonio da Costa, from April 4, 1546, till sometime in November of 1549, just about the period, you may remember, when the Portuguese Empire in India was at the top of its tide. Antonio da Costa dipped his finger pretty deeply into the political pie out there during those 3.5 years, and by his own showing he managed, too, to extract a goodly number of the plums. In one place he gives a sort of balance sheet of the gifts which he had received from the Raj with this and the Rani of that, and the total was a large one, even for those days of princely brigandage. But Antonio da Costa was a mystic as well as a robber, and by far the greater part of his diary is taken up with his dealings with those whom he frankly speaks of as the devil's children. One of these, a fakir for whom he prophesies a particularly hot end hereafter, he brought home with him to Portugal, and the last entry in the diary tells of a service which the fakir did him. I haven't got Jack's translation on board to show you, but I know that my memory of it is literally correct. It ran thus: "Today the fakir, whom hereafter the devil shall surely burn with fires of sevenfold heat, did, on a promise that he should be returned to his native land, perform for me here in Sintra that wonder which he hath already oft times, and not without revilings, denied me. Praise be to the Holy Virgin, who hath bowed the stubborn will of the child of Satan, and caused him to sell his magic unto me, Antonio da Costa, a devout and humble son of the Church, our mother. The fakir, whom the evil one shall burn, hath bound to my service the dread thing that is in the waters. Now, indeed, let my enemies take heed to their health. For the smell of the mice shall be in their nostrils, the fear of the pit shall be in their hearts, and they shall die. And no man of them shall know what slayeth him, for verily it is the terror of the bond." I remember that when Jack got to this point, he pulled at the front of his collar as though something were choking him, and I saw a big bead of perspiration drop from his brow, roll down his nose, and fall with a sharp pat on the old parchment. I remember, too, that though I had watched it fall, the sound made me start back with a sudden sucking in of the breath. Ridiculous, wasn't it? But the fact was that it was all I could do to hold myself in hand at all. The smell of the mice shall be in their nostrils. That was the phrase which struck me like a blow, for it came upon me with a flash that was the smell which had been in my nostrils half an hour before. "The smell of the mice," I muttered, in a voice which I hardly recognized as my own. Yes, it was that. Jack glanced up at me, nodded, and gave a queer little laugh. The old boy knew what he was describing, he commented lightly. "Don't!" I cried in a kind of horror. "I can smell it now. But go on. The rest?" "There's no more," answered Jack. "That's the end, except for a pen picture of Antonio da Costa himself. Like to look at it?" I held out my hand for the manuscript, and as I took it the dry parchment rustled in my shaking fingers. "Steady, old man, steady," whispered Jack huskily. "I know what you're feeling. I've been through it myself. But we've got to keep our nerve, you know, you and I, if we mean to see the thing through. Pull yourself together, old chap." The picture was that of a tall man in full armor, all but the head. Now I'll admit I was not in a proper condition of mind to judge fairly, but it struck me that the dark, big-jawed face which looked at me out of that old parchment was the most fiendish I had ever seen. It was a fat, sanctimonious face, you know, with the cruelty of devils shining through every sleek line of it. I dare say you know the type. It's a nasty one. The armor was, I believe, of the ordinary pattern of the period, except in one thing. The breastplate seemed to be meant to represent some sort of devilfish, and the tentacles of the brute were carried over onto the rest of the armor to complete the design. Two on each side clasped the man's body in a hugging embrace round the ribs, one ran down each leg, and one up each arm. If the device was Antonio da Costa's own, it certainly revealed a pretty taste in horrors. At the time I thought it merely horrible. Afterwards, but we'll come to that later. I handed the parchment across to Jack, and pushed my chair back. I hail a feeling as though I must act now, at once. I must do something violent to work off the tension of my feelings. I wanted to set my teeth and fight, or to run away at the top of my speed. "Well?" asked Jack. "What do you make of it?" "Nothing," I said. "That manuscript is 4 centuries old. It's absurd." Said Jack quietly, "it's that, and more, nearly 4.5 centuries, to be exact. But the smell of the mice, the terror of the pit, they're things of today. I've had that smell in my nostrils, and I have felt that terror. So have you. So has She hasn't. I interrupted wildly. Nora was frightened by some man. The cloak. I stopped, for I remembered that had been explained by the chestnut woman. Jack, it's horrible. I cried desperately. But you seem to hint that you see an explanation. What is it? Just this, he said earnestly. I believe that Antonio da Costa tells the plain truth in this diary of his. Start here. But I stammered. How can? And here I stopped. Jack waited for me. Well, what? He asked. Oh, I don't know. Nothing. Go on. I say I believe, continued Jack steadily, that da Costa's fakir laid some sort of a spell, some sort of a curse perhaps, upon the pond. Such things are done by fakirs in India even at the present day, you know, for these men have powers about which we know nothing, and it is only a fool that will read the evidence and deny that it is so. That terror of death, which both you and I have felt, is real. That horrible smell is, in a way, real too. In a way? I cried. Stop. What do you mean by that? I mean, putting it in terms of philosophy, that though it is real enough subjectively, it may not be real objectively. It may be imagination. It may be merely the working of the curse which makes the victim imagine that he smells mice. You see, I don't know that there is of necessity any horrible thing in that pond at all. There is a horrible font, and the rest follows from that. If I am right, the difficulty of the 4.5 centuries is nothing, but also, unfortunately, if I am right, I don't see what we are to do, for we have nothing tangible to fight against. Why, what on earth are you doing? I had taken off my coat, and was rolling up my shirt sleeve. I held out my bare arm for him to see. Just above the elbow there was an angry red mark, as though the blood had been sucked through the skin by a cupping glass. That's something tangible, anyway, I said. How did you get it? Cried Jack with a strange eagerness almost, it seemed to me, as though the sight of that fiery blotch on my arm pleased him. I told him of the touch I had felt when I scrambled screaming from the water. That red mark was the result. Proof enough that there was something more than imagination in the terror of the pond, I thought. Yes, said Jack, it's proof. Thank heaven, it's proof. If there's a thing in the pond which can touch, there's a thing which can be touched, a thing which can be killed. Are you ready to try? When? I asked. Now. I hesitated. A thing which could be killed might also kill. I'd like to see Nora first, I said. You won't tell her? No use in that, is there? No, I won't tell her. But I'd like to see her first, I insisted steadily. All right, said Jack. I understand what you mean, old chap. Then, if she comes down to lunch, we'll say this afternoon. If she doesn't tomorrow. I've some preparations to make in the meantime. Will that do? Yes, I said, that will do. Now, looking at the thing dispassionately and from a distance both of space and time, I'm afraid there can be no question but that both Jack and I were fools, and, of the two, that I was perhaps rather the bigger fool. I dare say, moreover, that you've come to that conclusion some time ago, so, if it's any satisfaction to you, I plead guilty here and now. But don't misunderstand me. I don't in the least admit that I was a fool for being afraid. On the contrary, I claim that my funk was wholly reasonable. But I was a fool for not yielding to that funk. I was a fool for not refusing point blank to go near that cursed pond again. I, a young man, not quite 23, engaged, with all my life lying fair with the promise of happiness before me, was actually preparing to walk straight into the jaws of a danger of which I knew nothing, a danger which might be death. I didn't pretend that I wasn't afraid. I had manliness enough not to do that. But I hadn't manliness enough to refuse to be led blindfold into danger, when another man, as foolish as myself, showed me the way. There, I've cleared the air a bit by that confession. Fill up your glass. You know now exactly what I think of myself. Nora did come down to lunch. She had got over her fright better, indeed, than either Jack or I had. But then she didn't know as much as we did. She tried to make light of it, and laughed at herself for her silly attack of nerves, but she didn't do it very well, and it was obvious enough to us what the effort cost her. Of course we pretended not to see anything amiss, and chaffed her with a heartiness which, on Jack's part at any rate, was inartistically exaggerated. She'd have seen through it at any other time, easily, but, on that day, it passed muster. She didn't even notice anything unusual in the way I said goodbye to her, before I went to join Jack in the tool shed. Poor Nora. She too was suffering from the terror of the bond. I didn't understand Jack's preparations when I saw them. But he was in command, so I did as I was told. You see, he explained, we don't quite know what we're fighting. In fact, we don't know at all, so there's no harm in being prepared in as many ways as we can. Better carry this old cavalry sword in your right hand. I've had it sharpened up. The revolver 7 shots, remember, in your left, and the bicycle lamp can be strung through the belt of your Norfolk. I'll rig myself out in the same way. What's the lamp for? I asked. It won't be dark for hours yet. Never mind, light it up. You'll see why, presently. Ready? Then come on. He led me out by the back way so that Nora shouldn't see us round the house and through the lemon grove to a boulder-strewn spot, about 20 yards to the east of the pond. There he stopped. Somewhere down in the valley an ox cart was toiling painfully along a rough road, and the shrieks and groans of the labouring axles floated up to us through the stillness of the afternoon. The country people say that the noise encourages the oxen, and so, except where inexorable town regulations ordain otherwise, they will not grease the wheels. At other times, I confess that I have found something soothing in the slow, long-drawn sound, but just now it rang through my brain like the wailing of a thing in pain. I turned impatiently to Jack, and asked what he was stopping for. This is the place, he said. This? Why, the water's 20 yards off, I objected. No, said Jack, not so much as that. I don't quite know how much, but not so much as that. Look under that flat boulder there, on the left. I did so, and gave a whistle of astonishment at what I saw. There was an opening, hidden under the overhanging stone, 2 yards wide by a yard high. I looked up at Jack with a question. A cave? I asked. I understood now what the lamps were for. Well, I don't know about a cave exactly, said Jack. Anyway, there's a big hole, and I'm told the pond water runs underground for some distance in this direction. I don't know how far, but I expect if we go down there we shall find out. If we go down there, I muttered. You mean that you are going down? Yes, said Jack quietly, I am going down. Aren't you? For a moment I did not answer. You needn't, of course, said Jack. I'll go, and you can wait for me here. Still I hesitated. The ox cart in the valley below was plodding steadily on, and I thought that the dry wooden axles shrieked at me like devils laughing. Then I turned and swung myself into the hole. Wait for me when you're inside, shouted Jack. And have your sword handy. Almost as he spoke he dropped down beside me. We tightened up our belts, so that the lamps should throw their light straight ahead, and then we went slowly forward, with our revolvers and swords ready. I remember that it struck me, incongruously enough in such a place, that in our slow, stealthy advance, we must have looked ludicrously like a parody on the Lisbon Patrol, as one meets them crawling along the streets in couples when the city is, or ought to be, asleep. Strange, isn't it, how one always thinks of such things at a time when even faculty ought to be concentrated on the business in hand. It was a real cave, after all, and it opened out as we advanced. We could not see more than a dozen yards ahead, because at that point it took a sharp turn to the right. We had expected that, however, because its original direction, if it had been continued, would have brought the cave a little to the left of the pond. As yet there was no sign of water, but I noticed that the path trended steadily downwards. Probably we should come to the water when we rounded the angle. A sudden exclamation from Jack interrupted my speculations. He was focusing the light of his lamp onto a spot close to the base of the wall on his side of the cave. There was a little heap of something there, with a grey fur or fungus growing on it in patches. What is it? I whispered, but I think that even as I spoke I knew what it was. Looks like old clothes, doesn't it? Muttered Jack. Uncommonly mouldy old clothes, too. He poked the heap with his sword. The sharp steel grated against something hard. He drew his arm back with a jerk. That, he said deliberately, is, I think we may take it, all that is left of one of my predecessors in this desirable country property. Poor devil. He hadn't much of a funeral. Like us, he was probably inquisitive. Jack said these words in a whisper. Somehow it seemed natural, in all this eeriness, to speak in a whisper. But I do not think he was afraid. I've told you of his terror earlier in the day. It was real enough then, in all conscience. But you can explain it as you please from the moment when I showed him that red mark on my arm, I believe that his fear entirely left him, and didn't come back either, though goodness knows it got an urgent enough call before we found ourselves on the outside of that cave again. Funny thing, courage. I don't think Jack Merrick would be afraid of the devil himself, if only the devil had the consideration to come wearing a body solid enough to put a bullet into. I'm not made like that, though, and I confess that the sound of the steel grating on the bones and that heap of rags sent cold thrills through me. I was sweating with horror, and I was in an uncommon hurry to get the job over, one way or the other. Come on, for heaven's sake, I whispered huskily. We turned the corner, and there at our feet was the water. The rays from our 2 lamps made splashes of light on its surface. Our eyes were dazzled, and the darkness which fringed the circles of light became, in consequence, darker still. It seemed as though, outside in the pond, there must be something disturbing the water, for a gentle ripple made the light splashes dance, and then rolled up and broke on the black, slimy beach at our feet. For a minute we stood there in silence, and then the blood ran to my head, my brain felt tight beneath the bones, and I swayed with a sudden rush of deadly sickness. For the smell of mice was in the air, faint as yet, but growing stronger every second. I began to spit and cough, and the sword fell from my fingers and clattered on the stones. As I stooped to pick it up, I looked at Jack. He was peering eagerly into a spot of light which he was guiding in slow circles over the whole surface of the water, but his face was screwed up into a tight pucker of loathing. Then it seemed to me that a thing like a black robe rose out of the light, and swung in a long curve towards me. With a yell I slashed at it, and felt that I had cut through something soft. The smell became a stench. There was a sudden churning of the water where the black rope had disappeared, and in a frenzy of terror I hurled my sword at the place. I raised my revolver and fired once, twice, 7 times into the water, and when I had done that, I flung the revolver after the sword. Then I turned and fled shrieking up the cave and out onto the grass above, where I lay and breathed the pure air of heaven in big, panting gasps. Then I remembered Jack. I had left him down there with that long, black, writhing horror. I must go back. The sound of a shot came from below. I waited, with my hands ready on the overhanging stone. If he was shooting, the chances were that he was all right. 5 seconds passed. Another shot. 5 more. A shot again. Heavens! The man was shooting steadily. Think of it. Shooting steadily, down there. In the presence of that thing. Watching the effect of each shot, perhaps, before firing the next. The 6 shots rang out thus at regular intervals, and then stopped. I remembered that Jack's revolver had 1 barrel fewer than mine. Was he coming? Yes, I heard him. I drew back from the hole, and he scrambled out, with positively the ghost of a grin struggling through the heavy puckers of disgust. He was a little bit breathless, for when his revolver was once emptied, he had not stood upon the order of his going any more than I had. "What an infernal smoke you made, old chap," was his first remark, "firing off your gun like that." I had to wait for nearly half a minute before I could see where to shoot. That's the worst of black powder cartridges. I ought to have thought of it, and put in the other kind. But that smell. Let's be off. I want a big drink of something to put the taste away. "You saw where to shoot?" I cried. "What did?" "Come down to the house and I'll tell you," he interrupted. "I must have that drink." "What was it you saw?" I repeated, when we had each of us drained about half a liter of Colares. "Not much, really," said Jack. "That smoke of yours was too thick. Ever seen a seine net being drawn in, with 6 kicking salmon in the end of it? Well, it was something like that. I fired into the liveliest place, and I think I did damage. That beastly smell, I can't get rid of it. We'll have another bottle. Shall it be fizz? Because, do you know, I fancy we've scored off the terror of the pond this time." Next day I was in bed, bowled over by what the Portuguese doctor said was an acute attack of nerves, in the feminine sense. The smell of mice seemed to me to be everywhere, in the food I ate, in the wine I drank, and in the air I breathed. The day after that I was better, and came downstairs. Still the same horrible smell. I wondered if it could by any chance be fancy, and I asked Jack whether he noticed it. "Notice it? I should think so," he answered with a laugh. "It's strong enough. You see, as the wind sets just now, we're on the lee side of the pond, unfortunately. That perfume has a range of 1/4 of a mile, my boy. It'll pass away, though, no fear." But it didn't pass away. It grew worse, and about the 5th day it began to change, and became rottenness. Then Jack decided that he would have the pond drained, and went down to the village to see about getting men. Not a man would do it, and so there was nothing else for it. We had to turn to ourselves, he and I. Well, I suppose the thing had to be done by somebody, but if it had been as sweet a job as picking violets, I'd have funked it. Pass me the whiskey. I get the taste in my mouth merely by thinking about it. The doctor stopped. I handed the whiskey to him and waited. I noticed that he spilt some of it as he poured it out, and when he lit his pipe, the flame of the match was jerked all round the bowl by the shaking of his fingers. "Well?" I said, after a sufficient pause. "You found?" He put me off. "Let's go on deck," he answered. "There's pure air up there, and I want a big mouthful of it. We should be somewhere near the Berlengers by this time." I followed him up on deck, and on the way he answered my question. We found a shapeless mass of blackness, a great homey thing like a bird's beak, and nothing more, he said. "I told you in the beginning that I didn't know what the terror really was. I've given you the facts as I know them. You can work out a theory for yourself, if you care to. I have mine, and if you know anything of the anatomy of devilfishes, the horny beak will give you the clue. Yes, though, I beg your pardon, we did find one thing more. Care to guess? It was a suit of old rusted armor, and the device on the breastplate was the device I have told you of." "Antonio da Costa's?" I cried. "Antonio da Costa's," said the doctor. "There were the remains of a skeleton inside the armor. Antonio da Costa's tooth, I hope." He broke off sharply, and pointed forward. "There's the light on the Berlengers," he said. "See it? Over the port bow. The old man's taking us inside, as it's a clear night." But I was not looking over the port bow just then. I was looking back, towards the hills of Sintra. But I could not see them, for a land mist had sprung up, and was lying over them in a black cloud. Presently I heard the doctor's voice again. "I had a letter from Nora when we got into Lisbon today," he was stating. "We're a couple of days behind time this trip, you know, and she wrote to say that she couldn't come over from Sintra to see me, because she'd arranged some swimming races for today. She has got up a ladies' water polo club down there, but some of the girls don't like playing in the big tank, because there are such a lot of goldfish in it now." Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.